this video we're going to have a quick look at how we can use data tables to be able to manipulate data and predict what will happen if our data changes. So we're going to start with a pretty basic model here. I'm using the example of product costing to explain the concept of data tables. So I'm using the extremely basic model where the total cost of a product is equal to the cost of the labour and the cost of the materials. So the figure we see here is just a sum of the two figures above. So what I'm doing here is that I'm establishing the relationship between the input values here, labour and material costs, and the output value, which is in this case the total cost. So the whole point of data tables is it gives us the ability to change values so we can see what the outcome is without having to do them one at a time. So what I've done is I've already entered the possible value changes. So in this first example we're saying what happens if the labour costs change by these amounts. Now obviously I'm only using 4 values, you can use as many as you like. So I'm going to use a data table to find out how the total cost is going to change based on these variations in labour costs. Now before I start making my data table, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, in this cell here, I'm going to type the equal symbol and I'm going to click on the total cost there. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying to the data table before I've even started it, use this relationship between the total cost and these two labour and material costs. In other words, I'm establishing the relationship between the output and the input values. Now the next thing I'm going to do is highlight the table. It's not a table yet, I haven't input it, but it's really important that I keep exactly to the model that I'm showing you here. So then I go to the data ribbon, go to my what if button and choose data table. Now I'm being given two choices here, but in this example I'm actually only varying one thing. I'm only varying my labour costs. I'm only varying one input. So I have established those, I shouldn't have clicked that, forgive me. I've established those as a column. So I'm going to completely ignore row input cell and I'm only going to pay attention to column input cell at this point. So I'm telling this data table that these values here are actually coming from the model here, from my labour costs. So I'm going to completely leave this top one blank and click OK. And then what the data table does is it looks at this data here, assumes it's a variation on input 1, which it is, and using this relationship to the other data, it comes up with all these values for my answer. So as you can see, if I did have a labour cost of £13, 13 plus 20 would give me 33, so it's given me the correct answer. Now I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight that one cell because the position of this cell is important. So remember, this cell here is where we were bringing over the calculation from the model answers. Okay, let's do another example. It's exactly the same thing that we did earlier, only this time instead of varying the labour cost, we're going to vary the material cost. So as I did before, I'm going to bring this calculation over into this top right cell here. Let's make it blue so we remind ourselves, and we're going to say it's equal to this cell. And now we will highlight. Notice how I am not including that, that's only there for your information. Go to the data, what if data table, again, it's column only, so I ignore row input cell, and I say this time the column input cell is my material cost. So I'm going to click here, material cost, and OK. And now what it's doing is it's changing the material cost in the calculation. So for example, if the material cost was £24 here, 24 plus 10 would give me 34. I'm going to do exactly the same thing again, only this time I'm going to do it as a row instead of a column. So if you can imagine, the values that I have put down here are the same values that we have above, only instead of presenting them as a column, I'm presenting them as a row. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to identify where I need to put my formula, where I'm going to put my equals, and bring that formula down. Now in the case of a row data table, it's bottom left. This one was top right, now we're going bottom left. So let me just make that blue so we know what we're aiming for. So in this one it's going to be equals to that. Same again. And if I highlight the data table, I'm not going to use column this time, I'm going to say my row input. So in other words, these values here represent my labour. And then it fills in the same information. Let's do that again. This time for material costs. I'm using a row, not a column, so I leave column blank, and this time I'm going to say I'm varying my material costs and you can see I have the same information, just in a different layout. So just remember, it's where you position these blue cells is very important. And so it's for column it's top right, and for row it's bottom left. So in the last example, I'm going to ask the data table to do not one but two variations on data. So in other words, I'm doing both example 1 and example 2 at the same time, and you can see I've already laid it out. So what I'm saying is, work out what will happen here in the center to my total cost for any combination of the material or labor values that you see here. So let's make sure that we know where that blue cell is going to be. It's going to be top left here. So let's start with that. So equals the formula I'm using in my model, and then I highlight the whole table, data, what if, data table, and this time I'm going to use both values. So the row, here are my rows, here are my rows and my material, and my columns, my column I should say, is my labour. Let's see if that worked. So yeah, we can see the direct relationship between the two. If the labour was 13 and the material is 24, I would get an answer of 37. I actually think it's easier to understand this than it is the single, the one-way table, as opposed to this, which is the two-way table. So that's all there is to it. I hope you found that useful.